For the first 3 weeks he didn't stir out of the house, but after that he started going out to sit on the little bench near the gate. I could easily understand his state of mind because I myself and many of my friends who had spent time in these camps had been through similar experiences. Some closed themselves off within themselves, others became frantically busy, but then got seriously depressed. I started talking to Father Arseny, said Nadezhda Petrovna later, asking him about himself, telling him about myself. I asked his permission to join him while he was praying or serving. At these times he became an entirely different person. It struck me that I had never before seen anybody like that. I remember one evening I had a terrible breakdown. I felt oppressed and extremely sad. My children, Yuri and Sergei, were constantly before my eyes. I thought of my husband, and something dark crept into my soul. I wanted to throw myself onto the floor and pound it with my head, crying, sobbing for all I had lost forever. Life seemed pointless and useless. What did I have to live for? What? I paced back and forth in my room, fell on my bed, bit my pillow, got up and cried with the tears running all over my face. Who could help me? Who would answer for what had happened to me? Who? I was so miserable that I wanted to die. I remembered how children suffer in orphanages and the horror of having to say goodbye to my children when I was taken away, and I seeing their eyes full of fear, begging me not to leave them, sobbing while the NKVD police were taking me away. Then there was the death of my husband, the interrogations, and my own life in camp. All this kept running through my mind with a terribly painful, terribly cruel precision. I would have liked to run somewhere and demand an answer to my question, why did all this happen? I was alone in the house. Pyotr Andreevich, himself exhausted and out of touch with real life, couldn't help me. But there was nobody else around, so, crying, I went to his room. A feeling of emptiness and anger possessed me, and I walked in without even knocking. Pyotr Andreevich stood in the corner in front of the icon of the Mother of God. The oil lamp was flickering, and he was praying out loud. I had walked in rudely, not knocking. He didn't even turn around. I stopped and distinctly heard the words of his prayer being so clearly pronounced. O my beloved Queen, my hope, O my Mother of God, protector of orphans and protector of those who are hurt, the Saviour of those who perish and the consolation of all who are in distress. You see my misery, you see my sorrow and my loneliness. Help me, I am powerless, give me strength. You know what I suffer, you know my grief. Lend me your hand, because who else can be my hope but you, my protector and my intercessor before God? I have sinned before you and before all people. Be my mother, my consoler, my helper. Protect me and save me. Chase grief away from me. Chase my lowness of heart and my despondency. Help me, O Mother of my God. Father Arseny finished praying, made the sign of the cross, knelt down, made several prostrations, said another prayer which I do not remember, and got up. I had stood there holding on to the door jamb, sobbing loudly, my tears pouring profusely. And I could hear in my mind the words of his prayer to the Mother of God. I can say now that I remembered these words for the rest of my life. I could recall them instantly and forever, as clearly as I heard them that day. When he was finished, through my sobbing, I managed to say, I feel terrible, help me. He asked me nothing. He pulled me away from the door and made me sit down on a chair. Through my sobbing, I started talking, at first in anger, then in irritation, and then finally I was at peace. My whole life, in all its minute detail, was in front of my mind, and I splashed it onto Father Arseny. I told him about myself, about my husband, my children, my grief, my suffering. I told him about my own life, my mistakes, my ambitions, my work. My past appeared naked in front of me in a completely new light. Telling about myself, I saw other people whom I had made suffer, whom I had belittled, and whose death I had perhaps caused. I saw everything in front of my eyes. The words of the prayer that I had just heard were invisibly present even while I was telling everything to Father Arseny, and shed light onto my path, onto my pain. I spoke for a long time, for several hours. Father Arseny, his hands on his desk, listened to me without moving, without interrupting me, without correcting what I was saying. When I had finished, I was amazed that I had been able to say all I did. Father Arseny stood up, went to the icon, checked the oil lamp, made the sign of the cross several times and started talking. He probably did not talk for long, but what he said made me understand my suffering in a new light, in a way I had not seen before. I saw that I also had suffered because of all the deeds that I had done. I realized that other people had suffered because of what I had done, but that I hadn't thought of them. I had forgotten their pain. Why should I be better off than they were? Father Arseny said, "It is good that you told me your whole life, because full openness is the beginning of the cleansing of the human conscience. You will find yourself, Nadezhda Petrovna." He blessed me 3 times. I didn't immediately become a believer, but I did understand that there was a very great deal, that I had pushed away from myself and had not found before. This is what I finally discovered with the help of God and Father Arseny. I first had to get used to him. Then I got fond of him and saw in him a totally unusual man who carried within himself a deep spirituality, faith, and goodness towards others. I could never have imagined that the emaciated, exhausted man who had come to me in his camp-issued cotton jacket would have such an influence on me, and that I would become a believer, I who had refused God and persecuted other believers. This conversation brought us closer. Father Arseny felt less shy in front of me. He thawed. He got interested in what was going on around him, and by the end of the 2nd month he had already written several letters, and probably 3 or 4 days after that several people came. I must admit that these people looked somehow strange to me, but only at first. Then I understood them, and probably became just like they were. I befriended many of them and simply loved them. In 5 or 6 months, I became Father Arseny's spiritual daughter. I went to confession to him, Nadezhda Petrovna said, but there was one event which happened early on that had perhaps the biggest influence on me. My husband and I had a very close friend named Nikolai. He was arrested at the same time as my husband and was given the same verdict. In 1955, they let him out, rehabilitated him, and returned all his privileges. He was going to Kharkov for business once, with a stopover in Moscow, and decided to come and visit me. I hadn't seen him after camp. We had only corresponded. He came, and I asked him about himself, told him about myself, why I was now living in this little town, and I told him about my children. He told me about his arrest, his stone camp, the interrogations, and he remembered who had denounced him with an invented case. He asked me about my daughter, and suddenly he asked, smiling, "Natalia, did you get remarried?" When I hung my coat, I saw a man's coat and hat. Whose are they? I answered him abruptly, but then caught myself and said that I have a lodger, someone who knew my husband during his last year in camp. Nikolai asked, "Who is he?" And I answered, "A priest, Pyotr Andreevich Streltsov. You cannot know him because for the last 4 years you and Pavel were in different camps." Nikolai jumped in his chair and shouted, "Why? What? Father Arseny here? Where is he?" He ran into Father Arseny's room, and I heard him shout, "Father Arseny, Father Arseny." I walked into the room behind Nikolai and saw how he was embracing Father Arseny. To my enormous surprise, he was crying, saying, "Oh Lord, what a joy to meet you again. I asked about you, looked for you through my friends, and nobody could tell me where you were. Please give me a blessing in the name of the Lord." They sat down and started talking, forgetting all about me. I left to make some tea. I was at the stove, and I kept thinking, what could have happened to my Pavel and to Nikolai? Why are they both so crazy about Father Arseny? I brought them tea. They didn't even touch it. In the evening, Nikolai came back to see me. While he had been with Father Arseny, I kept pondering, yes, all right, Father Arseny is a very good man, but for Nikolai to ask for his blessing, this I couldn't understand. What they talked about for all that time I did not know. Only much later, a few years later, Nikolai told me that Father Arseny had heard his confession. When Nikolai walked into to talk to me again. He looked enlightened. For the first few minutes he said nothing, but after that he spoke to me for the rest of the night, and only about Father Arseny. At first this irritated me. He had come to see me. He hadn't seen me for years, and then suddenly he goes and abandons me for hours on end. All right, Father Arseny is a good man, but Nikolai should not have left me, who had suffered so much. It really was inconsiderate. He could have waited and talked with Father Arseny later, so I said coldly, "Listen, Nikolai, I can see for myself that Father Arseny is a very good man, but why would you respect him so much? Why would you ask for his blessing? Why would you leave me and run to see him? You haven't seen me in such a long time." Nikolai looked at me with some surprise and started telling me about Father Arseny. He spoke for a long time, and I began to see Pyotr Andreevich in another light. I remember him telling me, "Camp Nadia showed me life in a new way. I began to see opinions, people, thoughts, events, even my own past, totally differently than I had ever seen them before. You know this just as well as I do. You were also in camp. When he is free, a person is good, faithful, a real friend, and you can trust him. The same person goes into a camp and you see that he is self-centered, can inform on anyone. He can be a traitor. In a word, he is a scoundrel. He wouldn't even take pity on his own father and mother. We saw people like that, and it is thanks to such people that we spent so much time in those camps and lost our loved ones in them. This person, Father Arseny, Nadia, saved hundreds of people from suffering. How did he save them? By a good word, by care, by helping. You know as well as I do what moral support can mean when you're in camp. It is essential, even more essential than food. In camp we all tried to regroup with people like ourselves, the party member with other party members, the educated person with other educated people, farmers with farmers, a thief with thieves, criminals with other criminals. If by some chance we were ready to help someone, we would only help people from our own clique. And let's admit it, we didn't help often. Father Arseny helped everybody. For him, good people and bad people did not exist. They were simply people who needed help. This is how he found me in your Pavvel. We were desperate. We wanted to escape, and you know that this would have meant death for sure. We said nothing to anybody. The day before we were set to leave, he came over to us and started talking to us. Stunned, we looked at him. How could he know? We were puzzled. We felt scared. He convinced us not to attempt the impossible, but he did it so gently and with love. We agreed peacefully. When I heard in the barracks that he was a priest, I started despising him because he didn't look impressive. But after I had lived in the same barracks with him for a year or so, he had become a guiding light for me and for Pavel. Look at him carefully, Nadia, and you will end up asking for his blessing also. The story Nikolai told me impressed me very much. By the time I myself had become attached to Father Arseny, but I had simply gotten upset and jealous because Nikolai had left me alone. Note of a woman named Tatiana. Early in the morning, a rust-coloured rooster would fly onto the fence and crow arrogantly. This was the time at which Father Arseny would get up and begin his morning prayers. Then he would go back to bed to get up at 7, at which time he would start serving until 9. From 7 till 9, all his spiritual children who were there would pray with him. Sometimes Nadezhda Petrovna would join them. After the service, he would talk with those who had come, or he would write letters. Sometimes when he didn't feel well, he would dictate his letters. He read many books about art and wrote articles. Very many people came, very many. Vera Danilovna was one, tall, white-haired and serious-looking. She seemed unapproachable, but was in fact an extremely good person. She was perhaps the closest friend Father Arseny had, and was a spiritual daughter who had come to him very early in his life. She was a medical doctor, and almost all of us were her patients. 2 other doctors also came. They were Ludmilla and Julia. who were the same age. A beautiful woman named Irina, aged between 45 and 50 and also a doctor, came with her husband and children. They all looked after Father Arseny, took care of his health, and sometimes succeeded in taking him to Moscow for a stay in a clinic. Father Arseny always protested that he didn't want to go, but the pressure was so great that he had to give in. At these times, Nadezhda Petrovna would gather his things together and Father Arseny would be pushed out of the house. When he was leaving, he would always say the same thing: "I'm perfectly healthy, this is just your imagination." Irina was a very special person, gentle, feminine, unusually good-hearted. No one could ever have imagined that she was a famous doctor, a professor with an important chair at the university. I didn't know Irina's story, but I observed that Father Arseny seemed to respect her. I remember the visits of the engineer Sazikov, who was handsome and elegantly dressed and who simply adored Father Arseny. He would walk with Father Arseny in the garden and talk. Sazikov was witty, clever, and seemed cheerful, but he had a constant sorrow in his brown eyes. He came often. During one of his visits he talked to me and told me that he had been in camp with Father Arseny and that he had been a thief, an infamous robber. I was surprised and answered that he was probably joking, but Sazikov said, "No, I'm not joking. I am a former criminal whom Father Arseny removed from the criminal world." Sazikov looked like someone who was entirely absorbed in his faith and in his work. I hadn't known who he was or what kind of person he was. Father Arseny taught us never to question anyone. 4 years after we first met, I happened to meet Sazikov in Moscow, and he became a regular visitor in our home, in our family. That was when he told me and my husband about his life. I remember another visitor, a man with white hair and a powerful face. He walked like a military man and had sharp eyes. He went directly to Father Arseny and silently greeted everyone who was in Nadezhda Petrovna's room. Father Arseny welcomed everyone who came to see him with joy and cordiality, but this person he welcomed especially warmly and intimately. Who he was, we did not know, and of course wouldn't ask anything about him. One day, Father Arseny called me in and said, "Meet Ivan Alexandrovich Abrosimov. When I am gone, do not leave him." I wanted to protest, but Father Arseny said intensely and clearly, "Do not leave him, do not leave him. You, Ivan Alexandrovich, be friends with Tatiana, be a good friend. When I am gone, find another priest." This is how we became acquainted with Ivan Alexandrovich. Alyosha came often. Alyosha, the student from camp. I didn't have to talk about him. Now we know him as Father Alexei, who serves and takes care of the parish that used to be Father Arseny's. Still I cannot resist, and I will write about our Father Alexei. While Father Arseny was still alive, the pleasant, radiant, blue-eyed Alyosha was his support and his hope. Gentle and good-hearted, he was responsive to people's suffering and gentle with everyone. He knew the services very well and prayed deeply. Who could have thought that Alexei would end up becoming the spiritual father of so many of us? I remember how Sazikov met Abrosyov at Father Arseny's. I also remember how they met Alexei. These greeted each other in the special way that can exist only when there are deep bonds, much deeper than simple friendship. I don't know if even beloved brothers could meet the way they did. Sazikov and Abrosimov adored Alexei's son, Peter. They showered him with toys and other gifts.